Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Science Society. Tonight, we're drifting into the fascinating world of psychology, the science that explores the most intimate territory we'll ever know, our own minds. As you settle in, I invite you to like and subscribe if you enjoy these gentle explorations of science. It helps more curious souls find their way to this peaceful corner of learning, one sleepy thinker at a time. But for now, simply allow yourself to relax. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we'll wander together through the landscape of human thought, emotion, and behavior, discovering how the mind reveals itself to those patient enough to observe. Psychology sits at the intersection of everything we experience. Every decision you make, every emotion that washes over you, every memory that surfaces unexpectedly, every relationship you navigate, all of these emerge from the intricate workings of the psychological machinery hidden within your skull. This science asks the deepest questions imaginable. What makes us who we are? How do thoughts arise from the firing of neurons? Why do we feel what we feel? How do our early experiences shape the adults we become? What happens when the mind struggles, and how can we help it heal? These questions have occupied humans for thousands of years, but only in the past century and a half has psychology emerged as a formal science, one built on careful observation, controlled experiments, and testable theories. Before that, understanding the mind was the province of philosophers, who could only speculate about consciousness and behavior through reasoning and introspection. The transformation of psychology from philosophical meditation to scientific discipline represents one of the great intellectual adventures of modern times. What makes psychology unique among the sciences is its deeply personal nature. When you study physics, you're examining forces and particles that exist independently of human experience. When you study psychology, you're turning the lens of scientific inquiry back upon yourself. The observer and the observed become one and the same. This creates fascinating challenges and opportunities. It means that psychological knowledge isn't just abstract information stored in textbooks. It's wisdom that can transform how you understand yourself, how you relate to others, and how you navigate the complex emotional terrain of being human. Tonight's journey will take us from the earliest days of scientific psychology through the great theoretical revolutions that shaped the field, into the discoveries that reveal how our brains create the rich inner world of experience, and finally, to the cutting edge of contemporary research, where scientists are uncovering truths that would have amazed the founders of this discipline. We'll meet the brilliant minds who dedicated their lives to understanding consciousness. We'll explore the elegant experiments that revealed hidden patterns in human behavior. We'll discover how the brain's chemistry influences everything from mood to memory. And we'll see how psychology continues to evolve, incorporating insights from neuroscience, genetics, cultural studies, and even artificial intelligence. As we begin, remember that this is not just a history lesson or a catalog of facts. This is a story about us, about the remarkable capacity humans have developed to examine their own nature. It's a story about persistence in the face of mystery, about the courage to challenge comfortable assumptions, and about the deep human need to understand what lies beneath the surface of consciousness. So breathe deeply, Let your mind settle into a state of gentle curiosity and allow yourself to drift into the quiet science of the mind. The birth of a science. Early foundations. In the late 19th century, in a laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, a man named Wilhelm Wundt was doing something no one had quite done before. In the year 1879, Wundt established the first laboratory dedicated entirely to psychological research. This moment marks psychology's birth as an independent scientific discipline, separate from the philosophy and physiology that had preceded it. Wundt believed that consciousness could be studied with the same rigor that scientists applied to chemistry or physics. His approach, which came to be known as structuralism, proposed that the mind's complex experiences could be broken down into their basic elements, much like a chemist might analyze a compound into its constituent atoms. Wundt's primary method was introspection, a carefully controlled form of self-observation. He would present trained observers with stimuli like lights, sounds, or tastes, then ask them to describe their conscious experiences in precise detail. These weren't casual observations. Wundt insisted on rigorous training and strict protocols. His observers would report the fundamental sensations they experienced, the feelings these sensations evoked, and the images that arose in their minds. Through thousands of such observations, Wundt hoped to map the basic structure of human consciousness. Imagine sitting in that Leipzig laboratory in the 1880s. The room is quiet, lit by gas lamps that cast gentle, wavering shadows on the walls. You're seated at a table, focused intently on a metronome that ticks with mechanical regularity. Your task is not simply to hear the sound, but to observe your observation itself. What is the quality of that clicking? How does your attention shift with each beat? What associations rise unbidden in your mind? This process of turning awareness back upon itself was central to Wundt's vision of psychology as a science of consciousness. Across the Atlantic Ocean, another founder was taking psychology in a different direction. William James, often called the father of American psychology, published his monumental work, The Principles of Psychology, in 1890, after more than a decade of writing and revision. James was less interested in breaking consciousness into pieces and more fascinated by its continuous, flowing nature. He coined the term stream of consciousness to capture how thoughts don't arrive as discrete units but flow into one another like water in a river, constantly moving, shifting, merging. James was a functionalist. Rather than asking what consciousness is made of, he asked what consciousness is for. Why did evolution give us the capacity for thought and awareness? What adaptive purpose does consciousness serve? This perspective led James to consider how mental processes help organisms survive and thrive in their environments. Memory, for instance, isn't just a catalog of past experiences. It's a tool that helps us navigate the present by learning from the past. Emotions aren't mere feelings. They're signals that prepare the body for action, speeding the heart when we face danger, or filling us with warmth when we encounter someone we love. James brought a pragmatic American sensibility to psychology. He was less concerned with abstract analysis and more interested in how psychological knowledge could be applied to real-world problems. His ideas influenced education, helping teachers understand how attention works and how students learn most effectively. He thought deeply about habits, recognizing that much of human behavior unfolds automatically, guided by patterns established through repetition. Understanding habits, James believed, was key to understanding how people change and grow throughout their lives. The tension between structuralism and functionalism represented psychology's first great theoretical debate. Were mental phenomena best understood by analyzing their components or by examining their purposes? The answer, as is often the case in science, turned out to be both. Later generations of psychologists would integrate insights from both approaches, recognizing that understanding the mind requires attention to both its structure and its function, both its parts and its purposes. These early psychologists faced enormous challenges. The mind doesn't present itself for direct observation the way a rock or a plant does. You cannot put consciousness under a microscope or measure a thought with a ruler. This invisibility created methodological problems that psychologists would wrestle with for generations. How do you study something that exists only as subjective experience? How do you make the scientific method work when the object of study is inherently private, accessible only to the person experiencing it? Despite these challenges, Wundt and James succeeded in establishing psychology as a legitimate field of scientific inquiry. They created academic departments, founded journals, trained students who would spread psychological knowledge around the world. They demonstrated that questions about the mind could be approached with systematic rigor, that consciousness could yield its secrets to patient, careful investigation. Their work opened a door through which thousands of researchers would pass, each contributing new insights, new methods, new ways of understanding the endlessly complex phenomenon of human mental life. By the turn of the 20th century, psychology was no longer a branch of philosophy or a hobby of physiologists. It had become its own discipline, with its own questions, its own methods, its own institutional structures. Universities were establishing psychology departments. Laboratories were springing up across Europe and North America. A new generation of thinkers was preparing to push psychology in directions Wundt and James could scarcely have imagined. The stage was set for the revolutionary ideas that would soon transform the field: the unconscious mind, Freud, and psychoanalysis. While experimental psychologists in their laboratories were studying conscious experience, a Viennese neurologist was about to upend everything psychology thought it knew about the mind. Sigmund Freud, working with patients suffering from mysterious physical symptoms that had no apparent medical cause, developed a theory so radical, so unsettling, that it would dominate clinical psychology for the better part of a century. Freud proposed that consciousness, far from being the totality of mental life, was merely the tip of an enormous iceberg. Beneath the surface of awareness lay the unconscious, a vast realm of memories, desires, and impulses that shaped behavior in ways the conscious mind could neither observe nor control. Freud's journey to this revolutionary insight began with hysteria. In the late 19th century, many patients, particularly women, presented with dramatic symptoms: paralysis, blindness, seizures, all without any detectable physical cause. Working with physician Joseph Breuer, Freud discovered that these symptoms seemed to have psychological origins. When patients were helped to recall and express traumatic memories they had repressed, Their physical symptoms often improved or disappeared entirely. This suggested that the mind could hide experiences that were too painful or threatening to acknowledge, pushing them into unconsciousness where they would nevertheless continue to exert influence, manifesting as physical distress. From these clinical observations, Freud constructed an elaborate theory of mind. He proposed that the psyche consists of three major structures. The id, present from birth, operates on the pleasure principle, constantly seeking immediate gratification of basic drives like hunger, thirst, and sexuality. The id knows nothing of reality or morality. It simply wants what it wants, demanding satisfaction with the insistence of an infant's cry. The superego, which develops through childhood as the child internalizes parental and social values, represents conscience and the ego ideal. It judges, criticizes, and imposes standards of behavior, often in harsh, punishing ways. Caught between these two forces stands the ego, the rational, conscious part of the self that must navigate between the ID's demands and the superego's restrictions while also dealing with the constraints of external reality. This constant conflict, Freud believed, shapes personality and generates psychological distress. When the ego cannot successfully mediate between these competing forces, anxiety results. To protect itself from unbearable anxiety, the ego employs defense mechanisms, unconscious strategies that distort or deny reality. Repression pushes threatening memories or desires out of consciousness. Projection attributes one's own unacceptable impulses to others. Rationalization constructs plausible but false explanations for behavior that actually stems from unconscious motives. Sublimation channels unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable activities, transforming sexual or aggressive energy into art, work, or intellectual achievement. Freud developed techniques for accessing the unconscious and bringing its hidden contents into awareness. Free association asked patients to say whatever came to mind, no matter how trivial or embarrassing, following the thread of thoughts wherever it led. This uncensored verbal wandering, Freud believed, would eventually reveal the unconscious conflicts creating symptoms. Dream analysis treated dreams as the royal road to the unconscious. During sleep, when the ego's defenses relaxed, repressed wishes could express themselves, though disguised in symbolic form to avoid waking the dreamer. By interpreting these symbols, Freud claimed he could decode the unconscious messages hidden in dreams. Freud's emphasis on sexuality shocked Victorian society. He proposed that sexual drives were present even in infancy, developing through stages that shaped adult personality. He suggested that many psychological problems stemmed from unresolved conflicts during these developmental stages. Even more controversial was his theory of the Oedipus complex, the idea that young children harbor unconscious sexual desires for the opposite-sex parent and hostile feelings toward the same-sex parent. These ideas provoked outrage and fascination in equal measure, making Freud one of the most famous intellectuals of the 20th century. Among Freud's followers, Carl Jung stands out as both devoted student and eventual rival. Jung worked closely with Freud for several years, and the two engaged in extensive correspondence about psychoanalytic theory. However, Jung's thinking diverged from Freud's in crucial ways. Where Freud saw sexuality as the primary drive, Jung believed humans were motivated by a broader drive toward psychological wholeness and self-realization. Where Freud's unconscious was personal, containing an individual's repressed experiences, Jung proposed a collective unconscious shared by all humans, containing universal symbols and patterns he called archetypes. Jung's archetypes included the shadow, representing the dark, unacknowledged aspects of personality, the anima and animus, representing feminine and masculine principles within each person, and the self, representing the unified totality of the psyche. Jung believed that psychological growth involved integrating these different aspects of personality, a process he called individualization. His ideas about archetypes influenced fields far beyond psychology, shaping literature, art, mythology studies, and religious scholarship. The relationship between Freud and Jung eventually fractured, partly over theoretical disagreements but also due to personal conflicts. Jung's departure represented a broader pattern in the psychoanalytic movement. Brilliant, independent thinkers attracted to Freud's revolutionary ideas would eventually break away to develop their own theories. Alfred Adler emphasized social feelings and the drive for superiority over sexual drives. Karen Horney challenged Freud's views on female psychology. Erik Erikson extended psychoanalytic theory to encompass the entire lifespan, not just childhood. Freud's legacy remains deeply controversial. Modern neuroscience has found little support for many of his specific claims. The structure of ID, ego, and superego doesn't correspond to any known brain architecture. His theories about psychosexual development lack empirical validation. Many of his ideas about women have been rightly criticized as reflecting the patriarchal attitudes of his era. Yet, Freud's influence on psychology and culture remains undeniable. He introduced concepts that have become part of everyday language: unconscious motivation, defense mechanisms, the Freudian slip. He pioneered talk therapy, the idea that psychological healing can occur through verbal exchange between therapist and patient. He insisted that childhood experiences shape adult personality in profound ways. And he made it acceptable to talk about sexuality, dreams, and the irrational aspects of human nature. Perhaps most importantly, Freud demonstrated that the mind contains depths we cannot directly access through introspection alone. Even if his specific map of the unconscious was wrong, the fundamental insight remains valid. Much of what drives human behavior operates outside conscious awareness. Modern cognitive psychology has confirmed this in countless ways, showing how perception, memory, decision-making, and emotion involve extensive unconscious processing. In this sense, Freud was profoundly right, even if many of his particulars were mistaken. The mind is not transparent to itself. Understanding human behavior requires looking beneath the surface of consciousness into processes that remain hidden from direct observation. The behaviorist revolution. By the early 20th century, psychology faced a crisis. The introspective methods of Wundt and the elaborate theoretical structures of Freud both seemed to many scientists to lack the objectivity and rigor expected of a true science. How could psychology be scientific if it relied on subjective reports of consciousness or unfalsifiable claims about unconscious processes? Into this uncertainty stepped a young psychologist named John Watson, who would transform psychology with a radical proposal. Forget about consciousness entirely. Study only what can be objectively observed and measured. Study behavior. Watson's 1913 article, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, served as a manifesto for a new approach. Watson argued that psychology should abandon introspection and consciousness as objects of study. These inner experiences, he claimed, were too subjective, too variable, too unreliable to form the basis of a science. Instead, psychology should model itself on the natural sciences, studying observable, measurable phenomena, what organisms do, how they respond to stimuli, how their behavior changes through experience. Psychology should be the science of behavior, period. This shift wasn't simply methodological. It represented a fundamentally different view of what psychology should be and what it could achieve. Watson was influenced by the work of Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, who had discovered classical conditioning while studying digestion in dogs. Pavlov noticed that his laboratory dogs began salivating, not just when food was placed in their mouths, but when they heard the footsteps of the assistant who usually brought the food. This observation led to systematic experiments demonstrating that neutral stimuli could be associated with biologically significant stimuli, creating learned responses. Pavlov's experiments followed a simple but powerful procedure. He would ring a bell, then present food to a dog. The food naturally caused salivation. After repeated pairings of bell and food, the dog would begin to salivate at the sound of the bell alone, even without food. The bell, originally neutral, had become a conditioned stimulus that elicited a conditioned response. This demonstrated that learning could be understood as the formation of associations between stimuli and responses, with no need to speculate about what might be happening in the dog's mind. Watson imported these ideas into psychology and pushed them to their logical extreme. In his most infamous experiment, he demonstrated that emotional responses could be conditioned in humans. Working with an infant named Albert, Watson repeatedly presented a white rat along with a loud, frightening noise. Initially, Albert showed no fear of the rat, but after several pairings with the noise, he began to cry and try to escape whenever the rat appeared. Watson had conditioned a fear response. Even more striking, this fear generalized to similar objects. Albert became afraid of rabbits, dogs, fur coats, anything that resembled the white rat. The little Albert experiment would never be approved by modern ethics committees, and it raises serious questions about the limits of what researchers should do. But it demonstrated something important. Complex emotional responses, long thought to be innate or arising from unconscious conflicts, could be created through simple associative learning. Watson boldly claimed that he could take any healthy infant and, through proper conditioning, shape that child into any type of adult. Doctor, lawyer, artist, thief. All behavior, he suggested, was learned. Give him control of a child's environment, and he could engineer any outcome. This environmental determinism attracted both admirers and critics. It suggested that humans were infinitely malleable, that proper training could solve social problems, eliminate crime, create ideal citizens. It also seemed to reduce humans to mere stimulus response machines, denying free will, consciousness, and the inner life that makes us distinctly human. Yet behaviorism's emphasis on observable behavior and rigorous methodology helped establish psychology as a respected scientific discipline. Behaviorist research produced reliable, replicable findings. It demonstrated that psychological phenomena could be studied with the same precision as physical phenomena. Behaviorism reached its zenith with Boerhaus Frederick Skinner, who extended Watson's approach in new directions. While Watson focused on classical conditioning where organisms learn associations between stimuli, Skinner focused on operant conditioning where organisms learn the consequences of their own actions. Skinner developed the operant conditioning chamber, commonly called the Skinner box, a controlled environment where he could precisely study how consequences shape behavior. In Skinner's framework, behavior that is reinforced tends to increase in frequency, while behavior that is punished or ignored tends to decrease. Positive reinforcement adds something pleasant following a behavior. A rat presses a lever and receives food, so lever pressing increases. Negative reinforcement removes something unpleasant. A rat presses a lever and a loud noise stops, so lever pressing increases. Positive punishment adds something unpleasant. A rat presses a lever and receives a shock, so lever pressing decreases. Negative punishment removes something pleasant. A rat presses a lever and food access is taken away, so lever pressing decreases. Through careful manipulation of reinforcement schedules, Skinner demonstrated extraordinary control over behavior. He trained pigeons to play ping pong, guide missiles, and perform complex sequences of actions. He showed that intermittent reinforcement, where responses are rewarded unpredictably, creates behavior that is extremely resistant to extinction. This explained why gambling can be so addictive. Occasional wins, occurring on an unpredictable schedule, create powerful motivation to keep playing despite consistent losses. Skinner's vision extended far beyond the laboratory. In his utopian novel Walden 2, he imagined a society engineered through behavioral principles, where positive reinforcement replaced punishment, where children were raised communally using scientifically validated techniques, where human potential could be fully realized through proper environmental design. His more controversial book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, argued that concepts like free will and personal responsibility were illusions, that all behavior was determined by environmental contingencies, and that accepting this truth would allow society to design better environments that promoted human welfare. Behaviorism's influence spread throughout psychology and beyond. In education, behaviorist principles informed programmed instruction and classroom management techniques. Teachers learned to shape student behavior through systematic reinforcement, breaking complex skills into small steps and rewarding progress. In clinical psychology, behavior modification emerged as a treatment approach for conditions from phobias to autism, using conditioning principles to establish desired behaviors and eliminate problematic ones. In animal training, professional trainers replaced punishment-based methods with reinforcement-based approaches that were both more humane and more effective. Yet by the 1950s, cracks were appearing in behaviorism's dominance. Critics pointed out that the approach seemed to work better for simple behaviors than complex ones, better for animals than humans. Language, in particular, resisted behaviorist explanation. Children seemed to learn grammar through some process more sophisticated than simple reinforcement of correct utterances. Linguist Noam Chomsky's devastating critique of Skinner's behaviorist account of language acquisition helped spark what would become known as the cognitive revolution. Psychology was about to rediscover the mind. Humanistic psychology, the third force. During the middle decades of the 20th century, as behaviorism and psychoanalysis competed for dominance in psychology, a group of psychologists grew increasingly dissatisfied with both approaches. Behaviorism, they felt, reduced humans to machines, ignoring consciousness, free will, and the qualities that make us distinctly human. Psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on unconscious conflicts and psychopathology, painted a dark, deterministic picture of human nature, where we are driven by forces beyond our control, always struggling with neuroses and repressed desires. Where, in either framework, was there room for human potential, for growth, for the striving toward meaning and self-actualization? These concerns gave birth to humanistic psychology, often called the third force in psychology, distinct from both behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Humanistic psychologists shifted focus from pathology to health, from what's wrong with people to what's right with them, from determinism to freedom, from reductionism to holism. They insisted that humans are not simply products of conditioning or victims of unconscious drives. We are meaning-making beings capable of conscious choice, growth, and self-direction. Carl Rogers emerged as one of humanistic psychology's most influential figures. Rogers developed client-centered therapy, later called person-centered therapy, which revolutionized clinical practice. Traditional psychoanalysis positioned the therapist as expert, interpreting the patient's unconscious, directing the therapeutic process. Rogers reversed this dynamic. He believed that clients possess an innate drive toward growth and self-actualization, an actualizing tendency that naturally moves organisms toward health and wholeness if environmental conditions support it. The therapist's role, Rogers argued, is not to interpret, direct, or fix the client, but to provide conditions that allow the client's natural growth process to unfold. These conditions Rogers called the therapeutic triad: unconditional positive regard, empathic understanding, and congruence. Unconditional positive regard means accepting the client completely, without judgment, regardless of what they reveal. The therapist doesn't approve or disapprove, doesn't label experiences as good or bad, but simply accepts the client as they are. Empathic understanding means sensing the client's inner world as if it were your own, seeing through their eyes, feeling their feelings, then communicating this understanding so the client feels truly heard. Congruence means the therapist is genuine and authentic, not hiding behind a professional facade, but present as a real person in the therapeutic relationship. Rogers believed that when people experience these conditions, they begin to drop their defenses, to explore aspects of themselves they've kept hidden, to resolve the incongruence between their real self and ideal self. They become more open to experience, more trusting of their own perceptions and feelings, more autonomous and self-directed. They move from asking, "What should I do?" to discovering, "What do I truly want?" This process of becoming, Rogers suggested, is what psychological health looks like. Not a fixed state, but an ongoing journey toward greater authenticity and self-awareness. Abraham Maslow approached humanistic psychology from a different angle. While most psychology studied rats, pigeons, and people with psychological problems, Maslow asked, "What can we learn from studying the healthiest, most fully functioning humans?" He studied individuals he considered self-actualized, people like Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln, looking for common characteristics. These individuals, Maslow found, shared certain qualities. They accepted themselves and others. They were spontaneous and natural. They were focused on problems outside themselves rather than self-absorbed. They maintained close relationships with a few people rather than superficial relationships with many. They had a democratic character structure that didn't need to dominate others. They distinguished clearly between means and ends. They had a philosophical rather than hostile sense of humor. They were creative, and they resisted cultural conditioning rather than conforming blindly to social norms. Maslow is perhaps best known for his hierarchy of needs, usually depicted as a pyramid. At the base are physiological needs: food, water, shelter, sleep. Once these are met, safety needs emerge: security, stability, freedom from fear. Then come love and belonging needs: friendship, intimacy, family. Next are esteem needs: achievement, recognition, respect from others, and self-respect. Finally, at the pyramid's peak are self-actualization needs: realizing one's full potential, becoming everything one is capable of becoming, expressing one's creativity and individuality. Maslow's hierarchy suggested that human motivation is progressive. Lower needs must be reasonably satisfied before higher needs become motivating. A person struggling to find food and shelter isn't thinking about self-actualization. But once basic needs are met, people naturally strive toward higher goals. This contradicted both behaviorism, which saw all motivation as drive reduction, and psychoanalysis, which saw motivation primarily in terms of sexual and aggressive instincts. Maslow proposed that humans have a fundamental need for growth and development, that we are driven not just to reduce tension, but to seek challenges, expand capabilities, and realize potential. Later in his career, Maslow added another level beyond self-actualization: self-transcendence, the drive to connect with something beyond the individual self, to contribute to others, to participate in causes larger than personal interests. This reflected his observation that the most fully functioning individuals weren't self-absorbed but focused outward, concerned with truth, beauty, justice, and the welfare of humanity. They had peak experiences, moments of profound connection, insight, or awareness that transcended ordinary consciousness and revealed deeper truths about existence. Humanistic psychology influenced not just clinical practice but education, organizational management, and popular culture. In schools, humanistic principles encouraged student-centered learning, where education focused on developing the whole person rather than just transmitting information. Teachers were encouraged to create supportive environments where students felt safe to explore, make mistakes, and discover their own interests and abilities. In organizations, humanistic ideas influenced management theory, suggesting that workers are motivated by more than money, that they need opportunities for growth, recognition, and meaningful contribution. Critics argued that humanistic psychology was too optimistic, that it downplayed human capacity for destructive behavior, that its concepts were vague and difficult to research empirically. Unlike behaviorism's precise measures or psychoanalysis's detailed case studies, humanistic psychology seemed to resist scientific validation. Its emphasis on subjective experience and personal growth made it challenging to study using traditional scientific methods. Some worried it promoted narcissistic self-absorption rather than genuine growth. Yet, humanistic psychology's contributions remain significant. It expanded psychology's focus beyond pathology to include health and optimal functioning. It emphasized the therapeutic relationship as itself healing, not just a vehicle for delivering techniques. It insisted that humans are more than stimulus response machines or bundles of unconscious conflicts. It reminded the field that consciousness, choice, and the search for meaning are central to human experience. And it paved the way for contemporary positive psychology, which uses rigorous scientific methods to study well-being, character strengths, and human flourishing. The cognitive revolution. By the mid-20th century, behaviorism's stranglehold on American psychology was beginning to loosen. The movement that would dethrone it emerged not from within psychology, but from converging developments in several fields: computer science, linguistics, neuroscience, and information theory. These disciplines shared a common interest in how information is acquired, processed, stored, and used, whether by electronic circuits or biological brains. Psychology was about to rediscover that the mind matters after all. The cognitive revolution didn't happen overnight. It built gradually through the 1950s and exploded into prominence in the 1960s. One crucial catalyst was Noam Chomsky's 1959 review of B.F. Skinner's book on language. Chomsky systematically dismantled Skinner's behaviorist account of language acquisition, arguing that children couldn't possibly learn the complex, rule-governed structure of language through simple reinforcement. Children produce novel sentences they've never heard before, following grammatical rules they've never been taught explicitly. This suggests, Chomsky argued, that humans possess innate mental structures specifically designed for language, a language acquisition device that contains universal principles of grammar. Chomsky's critique was devastating because language is central to human psychology. If behaviorism couldn't adequately explain language, what else was it missing? Researchers began to recognize that a comprehensive psychology would need to study internal mental processes, not just observable behavior. The mind wasn't a black box that could be ignored. It was the very thing that needed explaining. The emergence of computers provided psychology with a powerful new metaphor. If computers could process information, store it in memory, retrieve it, manipulate symbols, and solve problems, then perhaps the human mind worked in similar ways. The mind could be understood as an information processing system, taking in sensory input, transforming it through various operations, storing and retrieving information, and producing behavioral output. This computational metaphor suggested that mental processes could be studied scientifically without falling back into the introspective vagueness that behaviorists had rejected. Cognitive psychologists developed ingenious methods for studying mental processes indirectly through their effects on behavior. They measured reaction times, error rates, and patterns of performance to infer what was happening inside the black box. Memory researchers discovered that human memory isn't a single system but consists of multiple components. Sensory memory that holds information for a fraction of a second, short-term or working memory that holds limited information and for brief periods, and long-term memory that stores vast amounts of information potentially for a lifetime. Studies revealed the severe limitations of working memory. George Miller's famous paper, The Magical Number 7, plus or minus 2, demonstrated that people can hold only about 7 chunks of information in working memory at once. This limitation has profound implications for learning, comprehension, and problem solving. It explains why phone numbers are 7 digits, why we break complex information into manageable chunks, why cognitive overload impairs performance. The mind is powerful, but bounded. Understanding these boundaries helps explain both our capabilities and our limitations. Research on attention revealed that the mind is selective, focusing on some information while filtering out the rest. In dichotic listening experiments, participants wore headphones delivering different messages to each ear and were instructed to attend to one message while ignoring the other. They could do this successfully, but they noticed very little about the unattended message, not even if it switched languages. This demonstrated that attention acts as a bottleneck, selecting what enters conscious awareness. Yet, certain stimuli, like one's own name, can break through this filter, suggesting that even unattended information receives some processing. Cognitive psychologists developed models of how people perceive, remember, reason, and solve problems. These models often took the form of flowcharts or diagrams showing stages of processing, from initial sensation through various transformations to eventual response. Pattern recognition, for instance, might involve detecting features, matching features to stored templates, activating semantic information associated with recognized patterns. Reading involves visual feature detection, letter recognition, word recognition, accessing meaning, integrating meaning into the context of sentences and paragraphs, all happening so rapidly and automatically that skilled readers are unaware of these component processes. The study of expertise revealed dramatic differences between novices and experts in any domain. Experts don't just know more facts, they organize knowledge differently, see patterns that novices miss, recognize meaningful configurations where novices see chaos. A chess master glancing at a board can reconstruct the positions of all the pieces because they perceive the board in terms of familiar patterns and strategic relationships. A novice sees individual pieces. This has profound implications for education. Becoming expert requires not just accumulating information, but developing sophisticated cognitive structures for organizing and accessing that information. Cognitive research on decision-making, pioneered by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, revealed systematic biases in human judgment. People use mental shortcuts, heuristics, that work well much of the time but can lead to predictable errors. The availability heuristic judges probability based on how easily examples come to mind, which is why people overestimate the frequency of vivid, dramatic events like plane crashes, while underestimating mundane but common risks like heart disease. The representativeness heuristic judges probability based on similarity to prototypes, leading to neglect of base rates and other relevant statistical information. These findings demonstrated that human rationality is bounded, that intuitive judgment often deviates from normative principles of logic and probability. The cognitive revolution transformed psychology. Mental processes returned to center stage as legitimate objects of scientific study. The field became interdisciplinary, drawing on and contributing to computer science, linguistics, neuroscience, anthropology, and philosophy. Cognitive psychology developed rigorous experimental methods and formal models. It generated insights applicable to education, human-computer interaction, clinical psychology, and many other domains. And it created a framework that would integrate well with the neuroscience revolution to come, as researchers began to map cognitive processes onto brain structures and neural mechanisms. The brain and behavior, biological psychology. As psychology embraced the study of mental processes, advances in neuroscience were revealing the biological machinery that makes those processes possible. The brain, once an impenetrable black box, was beginning to yield its secrets. New technologies allowed researchers to observe the living brain in action, to trace the circuits underlying perception and memory, to identify the chemical messengers that modulate mood and motivation. Biological psychology, or behavioral neuroscience, emerged as a vibrant field connecting mind and brain, showing how consciousness and behavior arise from 3 pounds of tissue composed of billions of neurons. The fundamental insight of biological psychology is that mental phenomena are brain phenomena. Every thought, emotion, sensation, and action corresponds to patterns of neural activity. This isn't to say that mind reduces to brain in some simple way. The relationship between neural activity and conscious experience remains deeply mysterious. But it's clear that understanding the mind requires understanding the brain, that psychological processes have biological underpinnings, that behavior reflects brain function. Neurons, the brain's basic computational units, communicate through both electrical and chemical signals. Within a neuron, information travels as electrical impulses moving down the axon. But between neurons, at junctions called synapses, communication is chemical. When an electrical impulse reaches the axon terminal, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters, molecules that cross the synaptic gap and bind to receptors on the receiving neuron. This binding can either excite the receiving neuron, making it more likely to fire, or inhibit it, making it less likely to fire. Different neurotransmitters play different roles in behavior and cognition. Dopamine is involved in reward, motivation, and movement. Abnormally high dopamine activity has been linked to schizophrenia, while Parkinson's disease results from death of dopamine-producing neurons. Serotonin influences mood, sleep, and appetite. Many antidepressants work by increasing serotonin availability in synapses. Norepinephrine is involved in arousal and alertness. GABA is the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter, helping prevent excessive neural activity. glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter essential for learning and memory. Acetylcholine plays crucial roles in muscle movement and memory. Understanding these chemical systems has revolutionized treatment of psychological disorders. The brain's structure reflects its evolutionary history and functional organization. Deeper, older structures handle basic life functions and emotional responses. The brainstem controls breathing, heartbeat, and level of arousal. The limbic system, including the amygdala and hippocampus, processes emotion and memory. The amygdala responds to threats, triggering fear and the fight-or-flight response. The hippocampus is essential for forming new long-term memories. Damage to the hippocampus, as in the famous patient HM, causes profound amnesia, the inability to form new memories while old memories remain intact. The cerebral cortex, the brain's wrinkled outer layer, expanded dramatically during human evolution and enables our most sophisticated cognitive abilities. Different cortical regions specialize in different functions. The occipital lobe processes vision. The temporal lobe processes sound and is crucial for language comprehension. The parietal lobe integrates sensory information and manages spatial awareness. The frontal lobe, especially the prefrontal cortex, handles executive functions: planning, decision-making, impulse control, and working memory. Damage to the frontal lobe can dramatically alter personality, as in the famous case of Phineas Gage, whose frontal lobe was damaged by an iron rod, transforming him from a responsible, hard-working man into someone impulsive and unreliable. One of neuroscience's most important discoveries is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change its structure and function in response to experience. This contradicts the old view that the brain is fixed after early development. Instead, the brain continuously reorganizes itself throughout life. When you learn a new skill, practice a musical instrument, or study a foreign language, you're literally changing your brain, strengthening certain connections, pruning others, sometimes even growing new neurons. London taxi drivers, who must memorize thousands of streets to earn their license, show enlargement of the hippocampus, the region involved in spatial memory. Blind individuals show enhanced activity in visual cortex when reading Braille, as that brain region gets recruited for touch processing. Recent research has revealed sophisticated mechanisms underlying neuroplasticity. When neurons fire together repeatedly, the connections between them strengthen, a process described by the phrase "neurons that fire together wire together." At the molecular level, this involves changes in receptor density, growth of new synaptic connections, and even modification of gene expression. During sleep, the brain strengthens important connections while pruning away less important ones, consolidating learning from the day. A single night of intense learning can produce measurable changes in brain structure. Hormones, chemical messengers traveling through the bloodstream, also profoundly influence behavior. Cortisol, the stress hormone, affects memory, mood, and immune function. Chronically elevated cortisol resulting from prolonged stress can damage the hippocampus and contribute to depression. Oxytocin, released during social bonding, childbirth, and breastfeeding, promotes trust and attachment. Testosterone influences aggression, dominance-seeking behavior, and spatial abilities. Estrogen affects mood and cognition, which helps explain why some women experience mood changes across the menstrual cycle. These hormonal influences demonstrate that behavior reflects not just neural activity, but the body's broader chemical environment. The emerging field of epigenetics reveals how experience can modify gene expression without changing DNA sequences. Traumatic experiences, chronic stress, or enriched environments can cause chemical modifications to DNA or the proteins that package DNA, affecting which genes are turned on or off. These changes can influence brain development, stress responses, and vulnerability to psychological disorders. Some epigenetic modifications can even be passed to offspring, suggesting a mechanism whereby life experiences might affect future generations. This represents a profound shift in understanding heredity and environment. They're not separate influences, but constantly interacting processes. Modern brain imaging techniques have revolutionized our ability to study brain function. Functional MRI measures blood flow changes that reflect neural activity, allowing researchers to see which brain regions activate during different cognitive tasks. PT scans track radioactive tracers to map brain metabolism. EEG records electrical activity from the scalp, providing excellent temporal resolution to track how brain activity unfolds millisecond by millisecond. These technologies have confirmed that different mental activities recruit different brain networks, that cognitive processes involve coordinated activity across multiple regions, that the brain is constantly active even at rest, with default networks that become active when we're not focused on external tasks. Biological psychology has transformed our understanding of psychological disorders. Depression isn't simply sadness, but involves disrupted activity in brain circuits processing emotion and reward, along with altered stress hormone systems. Anxiety disorders involve overactive amygdala responses and difficulty regulating fear. Schizophrenia involves disrupted dopamine systems and abnormalities in cortical structure and function. Autism spectrum disorder involves differences in brain connectivity and development. Understanding the biological basis of these conditions has led to more effective treatments and reduced stigma by making clear that mental disorders are medical conditions, not character flaws or moral failings. Recent research continues to unveil surprising connections between brain and behavior. Scientists have discovered that omega-3 fatty acids can reduce aggression by approximately 30%, highlighting how nutrition influences mental states. Studies show that high-fat diets disrupt gut bacteria, which then affects brain chemistry and increases anxiety. The gut-brain connection, once dismissed, is now recognized as a major factor in mental health. The immune system, traditionally studied separately from behavior, is now known to influence learning, memory, and mood. The brain doesn't operate in isolation, but as part of an integrated system encompassing the entire body. Social psychology, how others shape us. Humans are fundamentally social beings. We live in groups, depend on one another, communicate constantly, coordinate our activities, form relationships, compete, and cooperate. This social nature isn't incidental to human psychology. It shapes who we are at the deepest levels. Social psychology explores how the presence of others influences thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, revealing that much of what we consider individual psychology actually emerges from social context. One of social psychology's most fundamental discoveries is the power of the situation. People often assume that behavior reflects personality, stable internal characteristics that determine how someone acts. Social psychology reveals that situations often matter more than personality. In many contexts, knowing the situation predicts behavior better than knowing the person. This was dramatically demonstrated in classic studies that shocked the world with what they revealed about human nature. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments remain among psychology's most famous and controversial. Participants believed they were helping study memory and learning. Their task was to administer electric shocks to a learner every time the learner made a mistake, with shock intensity increasing after each error. In reality, the learner was a Confederate who received no actual shocks but acted as if in pain, eventually screaming and demanding to be released. The experimenter, in a lab coat, calmly instructed participants to continue. Astonishingly, about 65% of participants continued to the maximum shock level, despite the learner's apparent suffering simply because an authority figure told them to continue. Milgram's findings stunned both psychologists and the public. How could ordinary people administer what they believed were dangerous, potentially lethal shocks to an innocent stranger? The experiments revealed the power of situational factors, the authority of science, the gradual escalation of commitment, the diffusion of responsibility, the cultural norm of obedience to legitimate authority. These factors overwhelmed personal moral standards. Milgram's work helped explain how ordinary people could participate in atrocities like the Holocaust, not because they were monsters, but because situations can compel monstrous behavior. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment demonstrated similar points about situational power. Psychologically normal college students were randomly assigned to play prisoners or guards in a mock prison. The study, planned for 2 weeks, had to be stopped after 6 days because the situation had become too psychologically damaging. Guards, given authority and anonymity, became increasingly abusive and cruel. Prisoners became passive and distressed, some showing signs of serious emotional disturbance. The experiment showed how social roles can overwhelm individual personality, how power can corrupt, how situational factors can elicit behavior people wouldn't have imagined themselves capable of. Conformity, the tendency to adjust behavior and attitudes to match those of others, is another powerful social influence. Solomon Asch's line judgment studies demonstrated this elegantly. Participants viewed lines and simply had to say which of 3 comparison lines matched a target line in length. This was an easy task with an obvious answer. But participants made judgments in groups, and the other group members were Confederates instructed to give wrong answers. Remarkably, about 75% of participants went along with the group's wrong answer at least once, even though the correct answer was obvious. Many participants reported experiencing serious doubt about their perception when it conflicted with the group consensus. Why do people conform? Sometimes for informational reasons. We look to others for guidance about how to interpret ambiguous situations. When smoke starts filling a room, people look to see how others react before deciding if it's an emergency, sometimes for normative reasons. We want to be liked and accepted, to avoid standing out or seeming different. Conformity increases when tasks are difficult, when groups are unanimous, when group members are attractive or high status, when the culture emphasizes harmony over individuality. Understanding conformity helps explain everything from fashion trends to political movements, to the spread of beliefs within communities. Social influence operates through multiple channels. Persuasion involves deliberate attempts to change attitudes through communication. The effectiveness of persuasion depends on the source. Credible, attractive, powerful sources are more persuasive. The message, clear, memorable, moderate rather than extreme arguments work best. And the audience, people who aren't thinking carefully, are swayed by peripheral cues like source attractiveness, while those thinking carefully evaluate argument quality. Cognitive dissonance, the discomfort from holding contradictory beliefs, motivates attitude change to restore consistency. When people act in ways inconsistent with their attitudes, they often change their attitudes to match their behavior rather than admitting they've acted against their beliefs. Group dynamics reveal that people behave differently in groups than alone. Social facilitation means that performing well-learned tasks in front of others enhances performance, while performing difficult or novel tasks in front of others impairs it. Social loafing means people exert less effort when working collectively than when working alone, presumably because individual contributions are less identifiable in group settings. Groupthink occurs when desire for harmony in a close-knit group overrides realistic appraisal of alternatives, leading to poor decisions. Group polarization means that group discussions tend to strengthen the initial inclinations of members, making moderate opinions more extreme. The bystander effect demonstrates how the presence of others can inhibit helping. When Kitty Genovese was murdered in New York in 1964, newspapers reported that 38 witnesses watched from their windows, but no one called police. This sparked research revealing that people are less likely to help in emergencies when others are present. The effect occurs partly due to diffusion of responsibility. With others present, each person feels less personally responsible for helping. It also involves pluralistic ignorance. In ambiguous situations, people look to others for cues, and if everyone appears calm, each person interprets the situation as a non-emergency. Yet humans are also capable of remarkable altruism. People risk their lives to save strangers, donate organs to people they'll never meet, volunteer time and resources to help those in need. Empathy, the ability to understand and share others' feelings, motivates helping behavior. People help more when they can take another's perspective, when they feel connected to those needing. Help when helping doesn't require excessive cost or risk. Evolutionary psychologists suggest that altruism evolved because helping kin promotes the survival of shared genes, and helping non-kin can be reciprocated, creating mutual benefits. Some helping, though, seems to transcend these evolutionary calculations, reflecting values, moral commitments, or simple human compassion. Prejudice and stereotyping represent darker aspects of social psychology. Stereotypes are generalized beliefs about groups. They simplify social perception, but lead to errors when applied indiscriminately to individuals. Prejudice involves negative attitudes toward group members. Discrimination involves a behavior that treats people differently based on group membership. These phenomena persist despite their irrationality and harm partly because they're functional. They reduce cognitive complexity, boost self-esteem through favorable group comparisons, and justify existing social hierarchies. Reducing prejudice requires contact between groups under conditions that promote cooperation toward common goals. Contact supported by institutional authorities. Contact between equal status individuals. And contact that allows participants to get to know each other as individuals rather than stereotyped group members. Social psychology reveals that we are more influenced by others than we typically realize. Our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors reflect not just personal characteristics, but the social contexts we inhabit. This knowledge has practical applications in marketing, politics, health promotion, and education. It also has profound implications for understanding human nature. We are not isolated individuals, but nodes in social networks, constantly shaping and being shaped by those around us. Developmental psychology, a lifetime of growth. From the moment of birth until death, humans are constantly changing, developing, transforming. Developmental psychology explores this lifelong process of change, examining how humans grow physically, cognitively, emotionally, and socially across the lifespan. This field reveals that development isn't simply a matter of growing bigger or learning more. It involves qualitative transformations in how we think, feel, and relate to the world. Jean Piaget revolutionized our understanding of cognitive development. Through careful observation of children, including his own, Piaget proposed that children don't simply know less than adults, they think differently. Children move through distinct stages of cognitive development, each characterized by different ways of understanding the world. In the sensory-motor stage, from birth to about 2 years, infants learn about the world through sensory experience and motor actions. They develop object permanence, the understanding that objects continue to exist even when out of sight, which represents a fundamental shift in how they represent reality. In the pre-operational stage, from about 2 to 7 years, children develop language and symbolic thought but remain egocentric, unable to take another's perspective. They struggle with conservation tasks, failing to understand that quantity remains the same despite changes in appearance. Show a pre-operational child 2 identical balls of clay. Flatten one into a pancake, and they'll likely say the pancake has more clay because it looks bigger. In the concrete operational stage, from about 7 to 11 years, children master conservation and can think logically about concrete objects and events, though abstract reasoning remains difficult. Finally, in the formal operational stage, beginning around 12 years, adolescents develop abstract reasoning, can think systematically about hypothetical situations, and can consider multiple perspectives simultaneously. Piaget's theory has been modified by subsequent research. Children's abilities emerge more gradually than his stage model suggested, and cultural factors influence the pace and nature of cognitive development more than Piaget recognized. Yet his fundamental insight remains valid. Cognitive development involves qualitative changes in how children represent and reason about the world, not just quantitative increases in knowledge. Attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, revealed the profound importance of early relationships. Bowlby proposed that infants are biologically predisposed to form attachments with caregivers, that this attachment bond is essential for survival and serves as the foundation for later social development. Ainsworth developed the strange situation procedure to assess attachment quality. In this laboratory setting, a mother and infant experience a series of separations and reunions while observers note the infant's responses. These observations revealed different attachment styles. Securely attached infants use the caregiver as a safe base for exploration, show distress when separated, but are easily comforted upon reunion. About 60% of infants show secure attachment. Insecure avoidant infants show little distress at separation and avoid the caregiver upon reunion. Having learned their caregiver is unresponsive to their needs. Insecure resistant infants show intense distress at separation but cannot be comforted upon reunion, displaying angry, ambivalent behavior reflecting inconsistent caregiving. These early attachment patterns predict later social and emotional functioning, influencing relationship quality throughout life. Adolescence brings dramatic changes. Puberty transforms the body, triggering not just physical maturation but hormonal shifts that affect mood and motivation. The adolescent brain undergoes significant reorganization, with connections strengthening in some regions while pruning occurs in others. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions like impulse control and long-term planning, is among the last brain regions to fully mature, not completing development until the mid-20s. This helps explain why adolescents can be both remarkably capable and frustratingly impulsive, why they're vulnerable to risky behavior despite understanding the dangers. Erik Erikson extended developmental theory across the entire lifespan, proposing 8 stages, each defined by a central psychosocial crisis. Infancy involves trust versus mistrust. Will caregivers meet the infant's needs reliably? Toddlerhood involves autonomy versus shame and doubt. Can the child develop independence while maintaining parental approval? Preschool involves initiative versus guilt. Can the child pursue goals without overstepping bounds? School age involves industry versus inferiority. Can the child master skills valued by their culture? Adolescence involves identity versus role confusion. Who am I and what is my place in the world? Young adulthood involves intimacy versus isolation. Can I form deep, committed relationships? Middle age involves generativity versus stagnation. Am I contributing to the next generation and to society? Late adulthood involves integrity versus despair. Can I look back on life with satisfaction? Erikson's theory emphasizes that development continues throughout life, that each stage builds on previous stages, that psychological growth involves resolving tensions between competing needs. Development isn't predetermined. It reflects the complex interaction between genes and environment. Some aspects of development appear strongly canalized, following similar trajectories across varied environments. All typically developing children learn to walk, speak, and recognize faces, though the timing may vary. Other aspects are more plastic, heavily influenced by specific experiences. Language learning illustrates both stability and flexibility. All human cultures develop language, and children acquire whatever language they're exposed to with remarkable ease, suggesting innate linguistic capacities. Yet, the specific language learned depends entirely on environmental input. Children not exposed to language during critical periods may never fully master linguistic communication, demonstrating that even innate capacities require appropriate environmental triggers. Sensitive periods in development represent times when particular experiences have especially powerful effects. Early childhood is a sensitive period for language acquisition. Deprivation during this period can have lasting effects, while the same deprivation later may be less consequential. The visual system has a critical period early in life when proper visual input is necessary for normal development. Children who have cataracts that block vision during this period may never develop normal vision even after the cataracts are removed, because the visual cortex didn't receive the input needed to wire itself properly. Modern developmental psychology recognizes that development is multidimensional, proceeding at different rates in different domains. A child might be advanced in language but average in motor skills. Development is also influenced by multiple contexts: family, peers, schools, culture, historical period. The ecological systems theory of Uri Bronfenbrenner describes how development is embedded in nested systems, from immediate settings like family to broader contexts like culture and historical time. Development reflects not just maturation, but the dynamic interaction between growing individuals and the multiple contexts they inhabit. Mental health and clinical psychology. Psychological disorders affect millions of people worldwide, causing significant distress and impairment. Clinical psychology applies psychological science to assessment, understanding, and treatment of psychological problems. This field has evolved dramatically over the past century, moving from institutional custodial care to community-based treatment, from long-term psychoanalysis to brief evidence-based therapies, from viewing mental illness as moral failing to understanding it as the result of complex interactions among biological, psychological, and social factors. Anxiety disorders are among the most common psychological problems. Generalized anxiety disorder involves persistent, excessive worry about numerous events or activities. Panic disorder involves recurrent, unexpected panic attacks, intense episodes of fear accompanied by physical symptoms like rapid heartbeat, sweating, and shortness of breath. Social anxiety disorder involves intense fear of social situations where one might be scrutinized or judged. Specific phobias involve irrational, intense fear of particular objects or situations. These disorders share excessive fear and anxiety that is out of proportion to actual threat and that interferes with normal functioning. Depression, characterized by persistent sadness, loss of interest and pleasure, changes in sleep and appetite, difficulty concentrating, and feelings of worthlessness or guilt affects hundreds of millions of people globally. Major depressive disorder involves episodes lasting at least 2 weeks, though episodes often persist much longer. Dysthymia, or persistent depressive disorder, involves chronic depressed mood lasting at least 2 years. Depression isn't simply sadness. It's a disorder of mood regulation involving changes in brain chemistry, particularly in systems using serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Depression also involves alterations in brain structure and function, with decreased activity in prefrontal regions and changes in the hippocampus. Bipolar disorder involves both depressive episodes and manic or hypomanic episodes. During mania, individuals experience elevated mood, increased energy, decreased need for sleep, grandiose thoughts, racing ideas, and impulsive, risky behavior. The dramatic mood swings can devastate relationships, careers, and financial stability. Bipolar disorder has a strong genetic component and involves dysregulation of mood-related neurotransmitter systems. Treatment typically involves mood-stabilizing medications combined with psychotherapy. Schizophrenia, affecting about 1% of the population, involves profound disruptions in thinking, perception, emotion, and behavior. Positive symptoms include hallucinations, typically auditory voices, and delusions, fixed false beliefs that resist contrary evidence. Negative symptoms include flat affect, social withdrawal, and lack of motivation. Cognitive symptoms include problems with attention, memory, and executive function. Schizophrenia typically emerges in late adolescence or early adulthood and follows a chronic course, though symptoms can be managed with antipsychotic medications and psychosocial interventions. Obsessive-compulsive disorder involves recurrent, intrusive thoughts or images that cause anxiety, and repetitive behaviors or mental acts aimed at reducing that anxiety. Common obsessions include contamination fears and concerns about harm or mistakes. Common compulsions include washing, checking, ordering, and mental rituals. OCD is now understood as involving dysfunction in circuits connecting the frontal cortex and basal ganglia, and treatment combines medications that increase serotonin with exposure and response prevention therapy. Post-traumatic stress disorder develops following exposure to traumatic events involving actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. PTSD involves re-experiencing the trauma through intrusive memories, nightmares, or flashbacks, avoiding reminders of the trauma, negative changes in thoughts and mood, and increased arousal and reactivity. PTSD involves persistent changes in brain systems involved in fear and stress response, particularly the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. Effective treatments include trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapies and medications. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder involves persistent inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that interferes with functioning. ADHD begins in childhood and often persists into adulthood. It involves differences in brain development, particularly in prefrontal regions and in neurotransmitter systems using dopamine and norepinephrine. Treatment combines behavioral interventions with stimulant medications that improve attention and reduce impulsivity. Autism spectrum disorder involves persistent difficulties with social communication and interaction, along with restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior and interests. Autism involves differences in brain connectivity and development apparent from early life. The spectrum concept recognizes that autism varies widely in severity and presentation, from individuals needing substantial support to those who are highly functional but differ in social intuition and communication style. Modern treatment approaches emphasize evidence-based practices, interventions demonstrated through rigorous research to be effective. Cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most extensively validated approaches, focuses on identifying and changing maladaptive thought patterns and behaviors. CBT for depression helps patients recognize and challenge negative automatic thoughts, increase positive activities, and develop problem-solving skills. CBT for anxiety involves exposure to feared situations combined with learning to manage anxiety responses. The approach is typically brief, structured, and focused on present problems rather than extensive exploration of the past. Recent research continues to refine our understanding of psychological disorders and their treatment. Studies show that people with higher anxiety or depression tend to use both adaptive and maladaptive emotion regulation strategies more frequently than those with lower symptoms, challenging simple assumptions about coping. Research on personalized medicine uses machine learning to predict which treatment ends will work best for which individuals, potentially revolutionizing how depression and other disorders are treated. Studies reveal that common medications can have unexpected cognitive effects, with some showing surprising benefits, while others impair certain cognitive functions. The shift toward understanding mental health from a biological, psychological, and social perspective. The biopsychosocial model represents major progress. This framework recognizes that psychological disorders arise from interactions among genetic vulnerabilities, brain dysfunction, psychological factors like beliefs and coping styles, and social factors like stress, trauma, and social support. Effective treatment often requires addressing multiple levels: medications to correct brain chemistry, therapy to change thoughts and behaviors, and interventions to improve social circumstances and relationships. Reducing stigma around mental health remains crucial. When people view psychological disorders as medical conditions rather than character flaws, those suffering are more likely to seek help, and society is more likely to invest in research and treatment. The message that mental health matters, that psychological disorders are real medical conditions, that effective treatments exist, and that recovery is possible, represents vital progress in how we understand and respond to psychological suffering. Contemporary frontiers in psychology. Psychology continues to evolve, pushing into new territories and revisiting old questions with new methods. Recent years have seen exciting developments across multiple domains, from positive psychology's focus on human strengths and flourishing, to the surprising connections between gut health and mental states, to the application of digital technologies in psychological research and practice. These contemporary frontiers reveal a field that remains vibrant, innovative, and deeply relevant to addressing modern challenges. Positive psychology, launched in the late 90s by Martin Seligman and others, represents a shift from psychology's traditional focus on pathology and problems toward understanding what makes life worth living. Rather than asking only what's wrong, positive psychologists ask, what's right? What are human strengths? What conditions foster well-being? This doesn't mean ignoring suffering or problems. It means achieving better balance, recognizing that psychology should help people thrive, not just help them avoid dysfunction. Research in positive psychology has identified key elements of well-being. Subjective well-being involves life satisfaction and the balance of positive and negative emotions. Psychological well-being involves purpose, personal growth, autonomy, environmental mastery, positive relationships, and self-acceptance. Character strengths like curiosity, gratitude, hope, and kindness predict positive outcomes. Flow, the state of complete absorption in challenging activities that match one's skills, contributes to satisfaction and achievement. Mindfulness, non-judgmental present-moment awareness, enhances well-being and reduces stress. Interventions derived from positive psychology research have shown promise. Gratitude exercises, like keeping a gratitude journal or writing thank you letters, increase happiness and reduce depression. Acts of kindness boost well-being in both the giver and receiver. Focusing on character strengths rather than weaknesses can improve performance and satisfaction. Savoring positive experiences by sharing them with others or mentally replaying them enhances their impact. These simple practices don't cure serious psychological disorders, but they can enhance well-being and resilience in the general population. Mindfulness and meditation have moved from Eastern contemplative traditions into mainstream Western psychology. Research demonstrates that mindfulness training reduces stress, anxiety, and depression, improves attention and emotion regulation, and even produces measurable changes in brain structure and function. Regular meditation practice increases gray matter density in brain regions involved in attention, emotion regulation, and self-awareness. It reduces activity in the default mode network, brain regions active during mind-wandering and self-referential thought, which may explain why meditation reduces rumination. The mechanisms underlying mindfulness benefits are becoming clearer. Mindfulness training reduces mind-wandering, that constant mental chatter pulling attention away from the present. It improves cognitive efficiency by helping people stay focused on relevant information rather than getting caught in cycles of worry and rumination. It enhances emotional regulation by increasing awareness of emotions without being overwhelmed by them, creating space between stimulus and response. This allows for more skillful responses rather than automatic reactions. The gut-brain connection represents one of psychology's most surprising recent discoveries. The gut contains hundreds of millions of neurons, sometimes called the enteric nervous system or second brain, that communicate extensively with the central nervous system through neural, hormonal, and immune pathways. The gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in the intestines, profoundly influences this communication. Research shows that disruptions in gut bacteria caused by diet, stress, or antibiotics can affect mood, anxiety, and cognition. Studies in animals demonstrate dramatic effects. Rats fed high-fat diets show disrupted gut bacteria, altered brain chemistry, and increased anxiety-like behavior. Transferring gut bacteria from anxious animals to normal animals can transfer the anxiety. Probiotic treatments that restore healthy gut bacteria can reduce anxiety and depression-like symptoms. Human studies are beginning to show similar effects. Certain probiotic strains may reduce anxiety and improve mood. The Mediterranean diet, which promotes healthy gut bacteria, is associated with lower rates of depression. This gut-brain research is revolutionizing how we think about mental health. Diet isn't just physical health, it's mental health. The bacteria in our intestines influence our brains, our emotions, our thoughts. This opens new avenues for treatment. Dietary interventions, probiotic supplements, and other approaches targeting the gut microbiome may complement traditional psychological and pharmacological treatments. Nutrition more broadly is receiving increased attention in psychology. Recent research shows that omega-3 fatty acids, found in fish and certain nuts and seeds, can reduce aggression by up to 30% across diverse populations. This highlights nutrition's potential role in managing not just physical health, but behavior and emotional regulation. The mechanisms aren't fully understood, but omega-3s influence brain development, neurotransmitter function, and inflammation, all relevant to psychological functioning. Recent discoveries about psychopathology are refining diagnosis and treatment. Research in 2024 revealed that psychopathic traits are more complex and varied than previously thought, with different traits disrupting learning and adaptation in specific ways. People with interpersonal psychopathic traits, like superficial charm and deceitfulness, show reduced sensitivity to rewards. This suggests that one-size-fits-all approaches to understanding and treating psychopathy are inadequate. Personalized approaches recognizing distinct profiles may be more effective. Digital technology is transforming psychology in multiple ways. Smartphone apps allow ecological momentary assessment, prompting people multiple times daily to report emotions, thoughts, and behaviors in real time and context. This provides far richer data than traditional retrospective surveys. Online therapy platforms make mental health services more accessible. Virtual reality is being used to treat phobias and PTSD through controlled exposure therapy. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are identifying patterns in psychological data that humans might miss, predicting treatment outcomes and even identifying individuals at risk for suicide based on patterns in language and behavior. The integration of psychology with neuroscience continues to deepen. Advanced brain imaging allows researchers to observe neural activity underlying psychological processes with increasing precision and sophistication. Optogenetics allows researchers to activate or silence specific neurons in animal brains, revealing their functions with unprecedented precision. These technologies are revealing the neural circuits underlying memory, emotion, decision-making, and consciousness. They're also enabling new treatments. Transcranial magnetic stimulation and deep brain stimulation are showing promise for treatment-resistant depression and other conditions by directly modulating brain activity. Cultural psychology emphasizes that psychological processes vary across cultures in important ways. Western psychology has traditionally assumed its findings are universal, but research reveals significant cultural variation in cognition, emotion, motivation, and social behavior. Western cultures tend to be individualistic, emphasizing personal goals and independence. Many non-Western cultures are collectivistic, emphasizing social harmony and interdependence. These differences aren't superficial. They shape fundamental aspects of self-concept, moral reasoning, and cognitive style. Recognizing this diversity enriches psychology, revealing that there isn't one human psychology, but many psychological patterns reflecting different cultural contexts. The challenges facing contemporary psychology are significant. The replication crisis revealed that many published findings don't replicate when other researchers attempt to repeat the studies. This has sparked reforms in research practices, including pre-registration of studies to prevent researchers from manipulating analyses after seeing data, sharing of data and materials to enable verification, and greater emphasis on replication. These reforms are strengthening psychology's scientific foundation, even if they require acknowledging that some cherished findings may not be as robust as once believed. Psychology is also grappling with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Much psychological research has been conducted on weird populations: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. This raises questions about generalizability. Are findings from college students in Western countries applicable to other populations? Psychology is working to diversify both its participant pools and its researchers, recognizing that diverse perspectives strengthen science. Closing reflections. As we drift toward the end of this journey through psychology, allow yourself to feel how interconnected all these threads of understanding truly are. The biological rhythms of neurons firing in intricate patterns, the chemical messages that modulate mood and memory, the developmental transformations that carry us from helpless infancy to complex adulthood, the social forces that shape identity and behavior, the cognitive processes that construct our experienced reality, the therapeutic approaches that help minds heal. All of these aspects of psychology weave together into a comprehensive picture of what it means to be human. Psychology reveals that we are simultaneously biological machines and meaning-making beings, creatures of evolution and culture, individuals and social animals. Our brains are organs weighing 3 pounds, yet they generate consciousness, that strange, subjective inner light that illuminates experience. Our behaviors follow patterns that can be studied scientifically, yet we experience ourselves as free agents making choices. Our personalities reflect both genetic inheritance and life experience, stability and change, continuity and transformation. The field of psychology, young as sciences go, has already transformed how we understand ourselves and treat those who suffer. It has revealed mechanisms of learning and memory, identified the biological basis of mental illness, developed effective therapies, understood child development, mapped cognitive processes, and documented social influences that shape behavior in countless ways. Yet mysteries remain. Consciousness itself remains deeply puzzling. The relationship between brain activity and subjective experience, how neurons become phenomenology, represents one of science's hardest problems. The full complexity of how nature and nurture interact across development is still being unraveled. The most effective ways to promote well-being and prevent psychological problems require ongoing research. Looking forward, psychology will continue to evolve and expand. Integration with neuroscience will deepen, revealing ever more sophisticated understanding of brain function. Digital technologies will enable new forms of assessment and intervention. Cultural psychology will broaden understanding of human diversity. Personalized approaches will tailor treatments to individuals based on their unique characteristics. Prevention will receive greater emphasis, identifying risk factors early and intervening before problems become severe. The science of well-being will mature, helping people not just avoid illness, but actively flourish. If you've enjoyed this peaceful exploration of the science of mind and behavior, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the Sleepy Science Society, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps build this community of curious minds, seeking to understand themselves and the world with scientific rigor and gentle wonder. Let others know about this quiet space where complex ideas become accessible, where learning feels like drifting rather than striving. For now, simply let these ideas settle into your awareness like snowflakes finding their place in accumulating drifts. You don't need to remember every detail. The important insights will remain, woven into how you understand yourself and others. Let your breathing slow. Let your body sink into comfort. Let your mind release its grip on these concepts and simply rest. Psychology is the study of you, of me, of all of us navigating this strange experience of being conscious creatures in a vast universe. It's the science of our inner worlds, our social dances, our struggles and triumphs, our sorrows and joys. Every psychological insight is an invitation to see yourself more clearly, to understand others more compassionately, to recognize the common humanity connecting all beings who think and feel, and hope and fear. As you drift into sleep, carry with you the knowledge that the mind examining itself represents one of nature's most remarkable achievements. You are both the observer and the observed, the scientist and the subject, the question and the mystery. In this quiet moment, that paradox resolves into simple presence. You are here. You are aware. You are part of the great human project of understanding consciousness from within consciousness itself. Sleep peacefully, knowing that tomorrow you will wake with neurons slightly reorganized by tonight's learning, with connections strengthened and memories consolidated, with your remarkable psychological machinery refreshed and ready to generate another day of thoughts, feelings, experiences, and meaning. The science of psychology is the science of this ongoing process, this daily miracle of minds making their way through the world. Good night.